Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to do a knife build that shows you don't need a whole bunch of fancy or expensive equipment to make good knives. And if you're just getting into knife making or interested in it, hopefully this helps you out. So let's jump right into it. We're going to line out a few tools that most of you probably already have some of these, and if not, they're pretty accessible financially. So this is the basic layout of sort of the backbone of inexpensive hand tools that we can use to make a good knife without a lot of huge investment up front. So real quick, we have a couple of angle grinders here. You don't need more than one. I just have a couple of different brands here to show you. This one's a Porter cable, this one's a DeWalt. Honestly, they're pretty similar. This one's about 30 bucks, this one's 50 or something like that. So this one works great, this one works great, whatever. The key with the angle grinders is going to be getting the different attachments or the different actual tools that you put on them. This is a wire brush, this is a flap sander, disc, this is a cutoff wheel, and of course you have your standard grinding wheels as well. All of these different pieces are going to help us accomplish multiple tasks with the same tool here, so we'll cover that in the video. We've got a hand drill here. This is also a DeWalt. There's lots of different brands out there that are great. It doesn't really matter. You know, they have a variance in cost, and you can just get what fits your budget. It doesn't really matter, but that's going to be really helpful and important for drilling handle tang holes and this kind of thing. So we've got that, and of course, you know, a lot of these things are stuff that you would use around the house anyway. So like I said before, you may already have half of this stuff. We've got a couple of vice grips here. This is different styles, but some kind of clamp to hold on to whatever you're working on, to clamp it to a table or something like that. That's going to be really important. Really helpful for when you're building your knife. This is a MAP gas torch, and you can do a lot with just this little torch right here. It's got the automatic ignition system on here. Now, it's important to point out that these MAP gas torches with the yellow bottle and this setup here are what you want to get. They're a little bit more expensive than, for example, your standard little propane torch. The reason is it's very difficult to get the kind of heat that you need for anything above a really small knife with these guys right here. These are more for soldering small things, pipes, copper pipes, that kind of thing. They just, you can use them sometimes, but they just don't work for when you need to actually heat treat a blade and stuff like that. So I really recommend spending the money to get this, and this will actually get you a lot of good use when it comes to building a knife. And of course we've got some sandpaper here. This is just a couple different pieces, but a good selection of, you know, several sheets of varying grits is going to be very helpful for finishing out your knife, and pretty crucial in the overall project. This is sort of the backbone. There's other odds and ends that we'll get into as we start the build, but this just gives you a rough idea. Basically, I want you to be able to go out and spend at most a couple $100, maybe less if you get stuff used or whatever, and you can be set up to make a decent knife. So let me show you how to do that. I do recommend working with a known steel, and the best way to do that is to simply buy a piece of steel. Something like 1080 high carbon steel is a great option to start with. But the theme of this video is knife making on a shoestring, and I have this piece of sawmill steel that I happen to know is 15 and 20, and so that's what we're going to be using today. It is essentially 1080 steel with 2% nickel in it. I've got an existing knife template here that I'm going to use to trace out our design, and knife design is important. I'm not going to go into that in detail in this video. This is just a nice little basic drop point style blade, very versatile. A lot of different applications. So now we have a template that we can use our tools to take off material and achieve that outline. I'm going to use a couple of vice grip clamps to secure this to the edge of my table, so I don't want it to move on me while I have the angle grinder in operation, of course. Now you'll notice the guard is removed from this grinder. I'm not recommending that, and you can be seriously injured. But if you do something like that, at least have some good protective equipment on yourself to try to mitigate any serious injury that could occur. Most of the time you should have that guard on there. There are some cases where perhaps it's not feasible, But anyway, this is how I'm doing it today, and you are capable of making your own choices in safety. Alright, we have our rough outline of the knife blank out. This next step is going to be made much easier if you do have a vise, which I'm not going to be using, but if you have the money to spend on a little vise, it doesn't have to be big, just a decent little vise, I highly recommend that even before some of the tools that we're using today. Now you might ask or wonder, why not do this work with a file and a hacksaw, that kind of thing, basic hand tools that are even less expensive than what we're using. And the answer is because this particular steel is hardened and tempered for its designed purpose, which was a sawmill blade. Therefore, filing and cutting this with a hacksaw is be nearly impossible. So if you want to purchase a piece of new steel that comes in a softened or annealed form, then the hacksaw and file route is absolutely much more feasible, but it also takes a lot longer as well. So we have our knife profiled out. It's still a little bit rough, but all this is going to be cleaned up in the future here. And so the next thing that we need to do is put some holes in the tang for the handle. And with what I just mentioned concerning the state of this steel, drilling holes in this is going to be very difficult to do without changing the internal structure of the steel. Fortunately, that's not difficult to do with a little bit of heat and some knowledge of how this works. Now, it would potentially be possible to not change the heat treat of this steel at all and finish out a knife and leave it in this state, and it could make a fairly decent blade, but not as good as it could be because the design purpose, i.e. a sawmill blade or the body of a sawmill blade, is not going to be the same thing as an edge of a knife. This needs to be particularly tough, much tougher than an actual knife, when it's being spun around on a sawmill at high rates of speed and subject to large forces that our knife isn't necessarily going to be. And so we're not going to leave it in this state. So heating it up is not going to be a problem because we're going to reheat treat this steel. But what it is right now is, the state that it's in right now is tempered martensite, which is what it's going to be after we're finished, but tempered to a different hardness. I want to change the internal structure of the steel, particularly on the tang here, to a spheroidized structure. And what that is a state in which the steel is softened or annealed because the carbon in the steel is segregated into large carbides, sort of pulled out of the structure of the steel, takes it out of the way, allows us to work with a softened state. And so we're actually contacting the ferrite or the iron more than we are actually the alloy steel. So not to get into too much metallurgy here, but the way we accomplish this is by heating this up to a dull red. We don't want to heat it up to a yellow or an orange because that will get us into the austenite range, and we don't want that. We want to just heat it up enough to allow that carbon to move out of the way. All right, there it is. Hopefully you could see that in the camera. I don't know if you could or not, but I got this up to a dull red several times and I was kind of concentrating on the two spots that I'm actually going to put the holes. So here approximately and here as well. So kind of got that up to a dull red several times, and that should be good. We'll just set this aside to cool, and then once it's cool to touch, we can continue on. It's worth pointing out that you pretty much always want to have a double clamp when you're using this kind of system, because with just one, the piece of work can easily twist around and spin on just the one clamp. So for ease of actually working and safety, 2 clamps is preferred. I'm going to start with a 1/8 inch drill bit and drill some pilot holes. My goal is to drill 1/4 inch holes so that we can use larger pins in this. So let's see how we did on our spheroidizing. Nothing to it. Alright, so the next step is to put the bevel on our blade. So that means we need to remove material at least on the bottom third of this blade to create an angle that the edge comes down to. So far we've used a cutoff disc, a standard grinding wheel, and now we're going to use a flap disc wheel. And this particular one's in 120 grit. I haven't seen them higher grit than this. If there was, I would use that. But we've roughed in the bevel on our blade with the grinding disc, which is a pretty heavy grit, meaning that we're going to have some real heavy grind marks. And we want to smooth some of those out with this 120 grit wheel and get us a little bit closer before we actually have to start hand sanding on this blade. The next thing I'm going to do is what I did with the Tang, which is heat the blade up to a dull red and let it cool so that it is in a softened or spheroidized state. You might ask, why didn't I do this before grinding it? Well, there's actually a good reason for that. You will find when grinding either on a large belt grinder or by hand that soft steel easily catches or grabs the wheel or the belt or whatever you're sanding with. And so it can be very easy to create divots and things that are difficult to get out further down the road. So leaving it in its hardened and tempered state from the saw blade, that gives us a little more resistance on our grinding wheel and helps us keep from messing this up to where we have to try to get out large divots and things like that. Now that we're to the point, and it's not an issue because we have the grinder that does the work for us. If we were hand filing, obviously that would be different. But now we're to the point where we do have to do some hand work, and we do want the steel to be soft before we complete the heat treating on it, so that is why we're doing it this way. Let me show you my favorite sandpaper that I have found so far, and that's after hundreds of hours of hand sanding blades with many different types of sandpaper. The Norton Black Ice, it's a waterproof paper. This stuff cuts and lasts the best out of every paper that I've tried. It's not a sponsorship, just simply what I have found through trial and error and spending money. That's my favorite. I'm going to start with 220 grit. And presumably we have this down to 120 grit already, so that's not too big of a jump, and then we'll work our way up to a higher grit from there.